Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and it really is a treat to be hosting Michael O'Hanlon this afternoon. And I'm in an unusual role for me here of being not just the host who's introducing, but the moderator. We're going to talk about Mike's new book, Military History for the Modern Strategist, America's Major Wars since 1861. Now, one of the main reasons I'm moderating is, well, Mike asked me, but also I was very pleased to say yes, because he and I go back a ways. When I was covering the Pentagon for the Washington Post back during the Clinton and Bush years, Mike was someone I sought out frequently for his perspective on military and foreign affairs, and so did many of my journalistic colleagues. And that's because Mike not only knows a lot, but he has a particular knack for explaining things clearly and often with the pithiness that the journalists love. I mean, he was really very quotable, and still is. He's been at the Brookings Institution since 1994, specializing in national security policy. His current title is Director of Research in Foreign Policy. He also directs a center at Brookings on security strategy and technology, holds a chair in defense and strategy, and co-heads the Africa Security Initiative. Is that all? Yeah. Well, that's not all, because he also teaches at Columbia and Georgetown, and been known to teach at George Washington and Princeton and elsewhere. And he serves on the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board. And on top of all that, he's quite a prolific writer, having written or edited more than 20 books and hundreds of op-ed pieces. And I also read somewhere that he's appeared on TV or radio about 4,000 times since September 11th. That's on your bio page, I think, and I don't know who's counting, but wow. So anyway, so as I said, Mike is quite knowledgeable about national security stuff and adept at writing and talking about these issues. And in his new book, he puts his skills to work to produce a study of war that is both ambitious in its breadth and impressive in its analytical depth. The book has a chapter each on the Civil War, on World Wars I and II, combined chapter on Korea and Vietnam, and then a chapter on America's wars in the Middle East since the Desert Storm war against Iraq to get them out of Kuwait in 1991. Of course, as Mike notes, these conflicts have all generated many previous books, and his is intended to complement these more detailed histories. It's more, as he puts it, it's more concise and a more conceptual look. The book does provide year-by-year summaries of each war, so it's really a useful reference if you want to go somewhere to get a quick summary of, well, what exactly was that war about? And there's a really helpful lessons learned section at the end of each chapter, although the focus is less on the details of individual battles than on the campaign strategies that tie all these battles together. It's history, as Mike puts it in the title, for the modern strategist, and that's where I want to begin my questioning of Mike with what exactly he means by the modern strategist. Who is this book really for, Mike?
Everybody in this room, Brad. I hope everybody wants it and likes it. Thank you for the privilege to be here. Thank you for what you and Lissa do at the bookstore. Did I turn it off? Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the privilege to be here, what you guys do at the bookstore, and just your friendship over the years. And, the modern strategist really is a policymaker trying to figure out whether we should continue a war in Afghanistan, how we should think about possible conflict against China, a voter, somebody who's just trying to make some sense of these conflicts, somebody who, like me, living in this area, sees all these battlefield signs for the Civil War and never quite knew exactly how all the different battles fit together and just wants to be a little less confused and muddled about what this or that placard means in the broader context. So I really try to write it for anybody who's interested in understanding warfare, but not necessarily a military history nerd, because I'm not myself. I never really liked reading these, 700-page books on the Battle of Trafalgar. I mean, God bless the people who do and who write them. And I certainly benefited from a lot of those kind of books in doing this one. But it's not really my passion. But I thought that as a defense scholar, or even just a citizen, I needed to have a working understanding of what were the big ideas in these other wars of our past, and what were the strategies, and also were there better ideas, better strategies? Did the wars have to end the way they did? Just sort of at a curiosity level, how did our country wind up where it is today? And we all go through some of that kind of learning in high school and take our history courses, but then we sometimes get more specialized in college, or we learn pieces of it. Well, I wanted to try to do it in a somewhat integrated way over really any war in our history that was sort of at the industrial scale, that was big, and that may therefore have some implications for how we think about future conflict. Yeah. So all the above, I guess.
I mean, I know you're a big advocate that military history should be taught more. You say somewhere in the book, military history is fundamentally sobering. So what is it that's particular about military history versus other kinds of history?
I think one thing that struck me in thinking about this series of conflicts was almost every time, all 7 of the big wars, whoever started the war usually thought it would be fast and relatively easy compared to how it turned out. And that's really a dangerous tendency in human thinking that I'm starting to believe is fairly inherent to who we are as people, or at least political systems, and therefore is dangerous for the future. That it's a proclivity that we probably still have. And so I think that was a big part of what I wanted to get at, and that I thought military history could teach us. Because if you go through, and just to give just one example that a lot of people have heard about but maybe read about or not in the past, World War I, and the way Germany had this Schlieffen plan to basically conquer France in about 40 days. And if they didn't pull it off, their whole plan was going to fail, because they needed to win that quickly to then put the troops no longer needed to defeat France on trains to get out east to defeat the Soviet Union, or Russia at the time. And because they assumed Russia would fight as well, since France and Russia had a quasi-alliance, but Russia was going to take some time to get ready. And of course, in the end, the way it happened was that Russia was just as much sort of the instigator, the immediate catalyst to the start of the war, as was Germany, but it still took them time. Anyway, the idea that you could map out the conquest of France on a 40-day schedule and just put people on trains and hold them to this, this exact day-by-day plan, and have it all work, and have this happen during a time when Germany, meanwhile, is contributing to the development of quantum mechanics and all these other amazing intellectual feats. This was a vibrant time in world history where a lot of people thought nothing like World War I could happen, because we're all working with each other, we're cooperating, we're globalizing, science is advancing. And so the same countries that were doing all this amazing stuff at that level were preparing for this senseless war. And part of it was because they thought they could develop plans that would work really well. They had these fancy new technologies. They had spent a lot of time mapping out their train schedules. That's just one example, but it just is indicative of the way people get overconfident in war. I think it happens more in war than in most other human endeavors, because in theory, if everything works quickly, you can in fact move hundreds of miles in a short space of time and wind up owning all this territory you didn't have before. So to an ambitious leader, it's sort of intoxicating and therefore dangerous.
Well, it's sometimes said that one way to avoid war is to prepare for it, but in this case, that wasn't, the opposite came true. It was because they kept preparing for it, it sort of became a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, thank you I think you've just partly deflated one of these cliches that may be half true if interpreted correctly, but is overused. And certainly, the North and the South were not ready for the Civil War militarily, but everybody was ready for World War I except us. And it happened anyway. And Hitler was certainly ready for World War II. And a lot of countries were reasonably well armed at that point. So yeah, I think that point is crucial, that being ready for war is no guarantee of preventing it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things you do throughout this book is draw these larger lessons, and you keep coming back to them. And another one another point you make is that outcomes of wars are not preordained. You know, we have a tendency when we look back at these wars to say, well, they sort of, I mean, they ended the way, you know, anybody would have thought they might have ended. But that's not really true, as you continue to show. I mean, in the case of World War I, the Germans almost, early on, their Schlieffen Plan almost worked.
It almost worked.
Yeah, and in the case of the Civil War, you know, if you look at, had things gone a certain way, the Confederacy might have won, or at least not lost. So, you know, that seems like kind of an obvious point, but it's sometimes difficult for people to absorb.
Yeah, so if I could build on that, and our colleague Bob Kagan, by the way, my boss is here, Suzanne Maloney, she's the best boss in the world. Also, half my tennis bosses are here, people who could dominate me on the court, so thank you for coming as well. And but Suzanne and I have a colleague, Bob Kagan, who just wrote, he's an amazing historian, I'm sure many of you know about, and he wrote this book, just published, Ghost at the Feast, about the United States from the turn of the 20th century to 1941. And in the course of his book event that we held at Brookings a month ago, he said, you know, it's so easy to forget because we learn history looking back, but we make history moving forward. And he was explaining why he was apologizing to his boss for why it took him 13 years to finish the book, even though he wrote a few other things along the way and there was no need for an apology, I'm sure. But you know, his main point was he wanted to get back and live each year, sort of as it felt at the time. And I didn't take 13 years to write this book, but I did try that same strategy because, you know, it really is true that you tend to think about these conflicts as having to, you know, of course the good guys had to win World War II. Of course the Union had to preserve the Union in the Civil War. But I would say as late as 1864, as late as the summer of 1864, the Confederacy still could have won the Civil War. And I'm not the first person to observe this, but it's striking because if Sherman hadn't taken Atlanta by September 1st of 1864, Lincoln could have lost the election to McClellan, the same general who had failed to succeed in the war's first year, and that Lincoln had this famous relationship with. And you know, McClellan seemed to think that he was in charge over Lincoln. We think we have problems with military insubordination in the 21st century. I don't think so compared to some of the stories of the past. But if Lincoln had not been sort of given that new burst of political life by the taking of Atlanta and then Sherman's march to the sea, and there's a very good chance that McClellan would have won the election and basically called a truce to the war, let the South go. And that's just one example, but that was 3.5 years into that war.
Right. So another one of these overarching themes that, again, would seem obvious, but it doesn't seem to keep nations and leaders of those nations from getting into war, is that war usually turns out to be harder and bloodier than expected. Now, why doesn't that point sort of carry over from generation to generation?
Because every so often it's not true. And the delusions of grandeur and hope for a quick win are very tempting, you know, and let's face it, it's not just one group of countries or one group of people who makes this mistake. I'm as big a fan as anybody of how the CIA foresaw what Putin was about to do a year ago and helped President Biden forewarn the world so that Putin couldn't claim some false pretense of justification. But the CIA got it wrong on expecting how the war would then ensue and thought that Zelensky and Kyiv might fall within a few days. And that was always a possibility, but it should not have been the expectation. Donald Rumsfeld thought the same thing about the Iraq War, that, you know, and he was sort of, let's say, 1/4 right, because we did overthrow Saddam in 3.5 weeks. Just turned out that, 20 years later, we're still not really done in Iraq.
And in Afghanistan, in the beginning, it looked like it was easier than we had anticipated, but then it turned out to be our longest and one of our costliest wars.
But exactly. But of course, Afghanistan also, you had this amazing early success where we didn't really have a war plan for what to do about the Taliban, but we improvised one. We had amazing people on the ground, these special forces and CIA teams. They worked with the Northern Alliance. They called in precision strikes. And all of a sudden, the Taliban's defeated in 2 months. And so that's why people have this tendency, because every so often it turns out to be true that a victory happens quickly and easily. And ironically, in World War II, some of Hitler's early endeavors were very fast and successful. Now, Hitler was prepared to fight as long as it took and as hard as it took. He thought there was this sort of cleansing virtue in conflict. He was a real psychopath, as I think we all know. But so he was sort of an exception to this. He was prepared to fight long and hard if it took that. But he also started to get intoxicated with his own success. And after quickly defeating France, he thought it would be easy to beat Britain. And then after taking the Balkans the following spring, he thought it'd be easy to take the Soviet Union and didn't even give his troops winter equipment as they approached Moscow. So again, because sometimes it works, it's tempting for the kind of person who winds up in political leadership. I think that's probably a different kind of human being than most of us, but many of them, at least many aggressors in history, like this kind of prospect of an easy, glorious win, and they can't resist.
Yeah. When you're talking about being overconfident in going into a war, in strategic terms, if you're planning to try to avoid war, you write that it's important to ensure that no enemy develops overconfidence in their ability to defeat the United States, say. Do you think that we're succeeding in that, at least today?
We're working hard at it, and I don't feel like I'm the only person calling attention to this danger. But if we look at how China could conceivably attack us, for example, it sort of tracks a little bit with how Japan attacked us at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese hoped they could knock us out long enough, not that they would defeat our industry, because they weren't even attacking our mainland or our factories, and they knew we had a lot more GDP and productive capacity than they did. But if they could sink our Pacific fleet and then go ahead and fortify a lot of the islands like the Philippine archipelago and just make that whole Western Pacific region sort of an impregnable bastion, or make it look that way, maybe we wouldn't try to return and exact our revenge. Of course, they didn't understand American psyche very well. But a lot of Americans up until that day wanted to stay out of World War II. And so I guess I can understand how the Japanese could have made that decision and made that mistake. But today, what China could hope is that if they destroy our airfields in the Western Pacific and blind our satellites, that we won't be able to help defend Taiwan, and that they can seize Taiwan quickly enough that we can't get back off the mat in time to prevent that, and that we'll decide that it's really not worth it to us to try to reverse the aggression at the risk of World War III and nuclear conflict. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the theory of victory we would need to worry about. And for some people, they would say, understandably, well, why should we be trying to protect Taiwan? Is it really worth World War III? And it's a fair question. And I think future presidents may debate it more than President Biden, who has said, as you know, 4 times publicly that if China were to attack Taiwan, that we would, in fact, in his opinion, during his presidency, come to their defense, mm-hmm. even though official policy is designed to be ambiguous. Mm-hmm. So bottom line, I think we need to make sure that we have alternatives to vulnerable airfields from which to launch weapons that could defeat that Chinese fleet. And we need to have, and we are starting to build, more survivable satellite and communication systems that are not vulnerable to that early blinding, because that's the theory of victory that I think is most credible.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you about a paradox that you mentioned in the book. It's a basic paradox about the American military in recent decades. I mean, we've had now for some time the best equipped, best fighting force, in the world, and yet we seem to be having a difficult time winning these conflicts that we get into. Why is that?
Yeah, it's fascinating, you know, and you and I have known each other since the early days of Iraq and Desert Storm. And if you want to view that as a separate war, then I guess you could say we had a big win since 1945. But if you view Desert Storm as just part of the 30-year saga, then we really haven't had any big wins since 1945. We lost in Vietnam, we lost in Afghanistan, we sort of stalemated in Korea, and it's too soon to say in Iraq. So I code that as 0, 2, and 2. Or if you want to make Desert Storm separate, then it's 1, 2, and 2. But in the way of answering your question, Brad, it's a really important question, and it's sort of one a lot of people have thought about, but it struck me doing this book that it deserves even more reflection. But just the first thing I really got just affixed to and fascinated by is what happened in Korea. Because here we were, in 1945, we had achieved the greatest military success in history with the best military, and we had invented all these technologies. We had a lot of help, including from the Soviet Union, and we should never, even though I have nothing positive to say about Putin or the Kremlin today, our debt to the Russian people and theirs to us is pretty mutual and pretty profound, because we won World War II together, and they did a lot of the dying, probably 25 million dead Russians and Ukrainians and others in the course of that war. But the bottom line is that we were trying to then demobilize and get back to life as normal. And 5 short years later, we can't even defeat the North Koreans. It's stunning. Yeah. And they just had 100,000 troops, old Soviet stuff. They weren't that well organized, weren't that well led. And admittedly, we weren't in position. And we had decided we didn't care about Korea. And we had publicly stated that until the day when North Korea invaded South Korea, and we changed our mind. And we pretty much went from 90% of the country thinking we didn't care about Korea on June 24th, 1950, to 90% of the country thinking we had to defend South Korea on June 26th, 1950. So that's also a sobering thought about how quickly we can change our minds in the event of a shocking action. But the point is, we went from being, you know, the superstar of all militaries to unable to defeat the North Koreans within 5 years of demobilization. Yeah. And I think a big part of the answer for that in our struggles in Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan is clearly we're choosing difficult wars that don't really suit our own strengths, don't play to our strengths. Mm-hmm. And probably in the end, most of them were not crucial to fight and win anyway. And so at some point we were bound to lose our verve and our national commitment. In fact, people say Americans don't have patience, don't have staying power. In some ways, it's sort of amazing how long we did fight each of these wars, given that none of them were really directly threatening our vital interests. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, I've had mixed feelings, and in the Iraq and Afghanistan debates, I've had, you know, various roles in terms of the positions I've taken. I haven't been a out-and-out peacenik by any means, but I still am struck, taking an historical perspective, that we didn't do well in any of these wars, even though for most of them we did have a very good military. Mm. We did have great technology. And I think a lot of it is we picked the wrong wars we ultimately didn't really need to win, especially Vietnam, but others as well. And over time, as the going got tough and we couldn't build nations in these difficult places, we ultimately lost our own confidence and desire to do so. Mm-hmm. But to finish, the most profound point is just that we have a bad military track record at the same time that we have the most successful grand strategy in the history of any great power. And it's such an amazing dichotomy.
Meaning, what do you mean by grand strategy?
So even though the world today is stressed, we still have more democracies, you know, 2/3 of the world's population living in free or partly free countries. As our colleague Homi Karas has shown at Brookings, more than half the world living middle class or above lifestyle because of the prosperity that this international economic system has brought. And we have not had great power war, even though we've come perilously close and maybe closer than we'd like right now. So great power peace, democracy, prosperity, that's an amazing track record, yeah. Even though we've made tons of mistakes along the way.
Yeah. Hey, when we were talking before we came out here, I asked you, of all these wars that you write about in the book, which was the one that you knew the least about? And you told me Korea. And so what was most striking to you in teaching yourself more about Korea?
Yeah, Korea, and probably I should have said World War I, although I think thanks to people like you running bookstores like this, a lot of us read more about World War I in the last 9 years from the centennial of its start. So, you know, Korea, it was often called the Forgotten War. And my dad served in Korea, but not until after the fighting was over, because a lot of people obviously have served there since combat. We've had a ceasefire since 1953. And therefore, it was never a glorious war with a clear finish or even a clear defeat. And so it was hard to know what to do with it. And there were a lot of impressive performances by individual Americans, and like the Marines at the Chosin Reservoir or the Incheon landing. But there were a lot of disastrous encounters and operations as well. And probably, in my judgment, the single closest action to approaching treason of any American general in U.S. military history, with MacArthur advocating that we attack China and consider nuclear weapons use, even after his commander-in-chief had been telling him not to for months. And so Korea's messy, it's inconclusive, and it quickly got swallowed up, even at the time, by the Vietnam conflict in terms of the importance the country paid to it and what it did to our politics. So I think Korea was an easy one, and for most of us, an easy one to ignore. And even though I knew a couple of the highlights, like Task Force Smith, the beginning, failing to be able to stop the North Koreans, and then the Incheon landing and the crossing of the 38th parallel and the approach to the Yalu and the Chinese intervention, I could say that much. But that was about it. And I think the person I really became fascinated by, and my good friend Dave Petraeus is fascinated by this guy too, is General Matthew Ridgway, who came into Korea about 6 months into the conflict and then replaced MacArthur by the spring of 1951. And by that point, we really started to, Ridgway figured out how to go back to basics and consolidate our positions. And he was probably a general who was good tactically as well as strategically in a way that very few generals in our history have had to do or have achieved as well. And so I think learning about that period, then it was just an ugly slog for a year and a half as we tried to get some kind of negotiated settlement to basically just restore the status quo. But prisoner issues and things like that held up the talks. And again, it's sort of sobering that who knows how long the Ukraine war is going to go. Even if we get to a point where you could start to imagine the parameters of a peace, you could imagine talks dragging on for months or years, because that's often been the way it's happened in the past.
Mm-hmm. We're going to get to audience questions soon, but I just want to go through a couple of the factors, key factors of war, and I'll just mention them one by one, and have you comment on how important they are and why they're important in the various wars that you look at. And one of the first factors that count in war is leadership, right? So how does that factor in?
It's a great question. I think starting with the Civil War, which is how I began the book, you just have to be incredibly impressed with Lincoln in so many ways, but also because you can see the limits even of Lincoln, because, so maybe I'll just dwell on Lincoln for this answer, because, you know, the North was not ready for this war. And the Battle of Manassas in July 1861 happened sort of like a carnival. It was almost like a scheduled fight. People took their picnics out. And Lincoln himself had been quoted recently as saying he didn't think it would take more than 2 or 3 regiments of Union troops, you know, a couple thousand, to put down the rebellion. Mm-hmm. And his old nemesis, Stephen Douglas, from the 1858 debates in the Senate race, who it turns out was about to die at this point in April 1861, Douglas had to come lobby Lincoln to build up the Union Army to even 200,000 troops, because Lincoln was still hoping at that point, even after Fort Sumter, that this would be a quick operation. But I can't really blame Lincoln, because he had so much else on his mind. And the leadership that he displayed in first trying to persuade the South not to secede, just saying, we can worry about the long-term future of slavery on your current territory some other day, decade, generation. That's not what I want to fight about. I don't want to fight about anything, but I will make it harder for you to interfere with or to continue the spread of slavery. And that's where he was drawing the line, and the South knew it, and this, started seceding even before he was inaugurated. So Lincoln had to spend a lot of time just trying to hold the Union together, keep the politics working, prevent the European powers from recognizing the Confederacy and helping them. And maybe one of my favorite Lincoln lines, I'm sure a lot of you know it, but you can never quote Lincoln too much. Somebody asked him early in 1861 if he thought God was on the side of the Union. And he said, well, I sure hope God is on our side, but what I really need is Kentucky. Because he was so focused on keeping the border states from seceding. Because imagine if Maryland had seceded and gone over, and Maryland had a lot of slaves on the Eastern Shore. Right. So in that sense, Lincoln's leadership was unbelievable and inspiring, and yet even he only had a big enough brain to sort of get half of what he needed to do right. Now, in that world of 1861, we had a Department of War that had 93 people in it at the time of so he didn't have much help. Yeah. And then he chose a Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, who was notorious for just being incompetent. And basically Lincoln gave him the choice of a couple departments and said, which one do you want? And he took War. Yeah. And Lincoln would have been better advised to put Secretary Stanton there sooner. Yeah. That's who we wound up with. Yeah. But anyway, Lincoln was doing a lot of this on his own. Yeah. And it just goes to show that leadership is really hard, and even our maybe best leader in history couldn't get every detail or even the military part right.
Well, another point you make about leadership in that chapter on the Civil War is that very often the best commanders are not easily identifiable at first, that sometimes they emerge only after being tested by war, right?
Yeah, and of course there are all these stories about Grant too, right? And he had his detractors and people who said he drank a little more than his station in life required. That was one of the ways they put it back in that day. And of course Lincoln said, well, if Grant's doing, drinking too much, could you find out what kind of whiskey he's consuming and send the same kind to all my other generals too? Because I could use a little bit of Grant and the rest of them. But Grant did have a big flaw, which is that he liked horseback riding too much. And after he had laid siege to Vicksburg and basically opened up the Mississippi for the Union in July of 1863, and before he became commander of all Union forces, he went out on a race with somebody and got knocked off his horse and wound up in a hospital for a month, and he was unconscious for a while. This is the same guy who we needed to, go win the war, but he got himself hurt on a bet. Yeah. But you're right that he turned out to be sensational, and one of the ways he was sensational, apart from some of these tactical genius moves like at Vicksburg, is he wound up doing something I know I couldn't do, and a lot of things he did I couldn't do, but he was tough in the face of casualties. And a lot of the Civil War is a story of the two sides fighting and having some big battle and killing 10,000, collectively, and with another 30, 50,000 wounded. Yeah. And then after a day or two or three of that, they were tired. Yeah. And they were trying to, do their amputations and try to keep whatever number of people they could alive. And so they didn't pursue each other very much, even when they had the advantage. Mm-hmm. But Grant figured out by the spring of 1864, along with General Meade, that if they just kept plugging away, that they would win. Because another one of the famous lines is Grant figured out, not the best English, but he said, "The enemy hath not army enough." and so he just kept pounding away and started up here at the Wilderness and Spotsylvania and then Cold Harbor, and he just kept coming south all through the spring and into the summer and fall of 1864. Still wasn't done with the job. As our buddy Jay Winnick wrote, it took it took that entire year and into 1865 to complete that campaign. It was a year-long campaign, but Grant knew he had the numbers and he could keep replenishing his losses better than Lee, and he had. He was losing each battle pretty much. I mean, he was suffering 50% more casualties every battle, but he just kept at it. So he was sort of callous enough to get the job done.
Yeah. Let me just mention three other factors that come up throughout your book as being important in determining the outcome of wars. And you can just give me, I said in my intro that you were very quotable and pithy. so you can give me quotable, pithy responses to each of these factors. So another one is geography, technology, and alliances. Geography, technology, and alliances. How do they factor?
So geography, like you say, there's so many things to draw upon. But going back to World War I, the reason why Germany wanted to do this 40-day Schlieffen plan is because all the distances are pretty short in Western Europe. And so it almost worked. And then it settled into trench warfare. And that's pretty much how it stayed for 3+ years. Whereas in the East, it was much more fluid because same kind of technology, same kind of armies. And Germany was, a belligerent in both. But just the geography lent itself to a lot more maneuver and a lot more movement. So that would be an example on the geography front. Obviously there are a lot of other examples, but that one comes to mind first.
And how about technology?
Technology is, I'd maybe say two things. One is that it's sort of amazing how much people forget or fail to appreciate the new kinds of technologies that they're starting a war with, even when they should have known better. And again, World War I, they should have remembered the Civil War. They wanted to remember their heroic quick fights, like in the Boer War in Africa or things like that. They're 2-week-long engagements. But the technologies of exposed human flesh being vulnerable to artillery and small arms fire and automatic weapons, which is something that Vladimir Putin doesn't seem to appreciate very well, that was an aspect of technology that was not sufficiently appreciated, even though it should have been. And the other thing is World War II was an amazing incubator of technology. And obviously it ended up with nuclear weapons, but a lot of the innovations in radar, in aircraft, in submarines, in amphibious assault, just World War II, the years before it, but especially the war itself, was a period of striking change, and where the armies almost didn't even, and navies, they certainly didn't look how they had in the 30s or 20s or World War I, but they almost looked different by 1945 than they had in 1939. They were being used much differently. So that would be also a striking example for me of just how far technology advanced. However, sorry, I'm not being pithy, but World War II, one more thing I've thought about, and I'm sure other people here have as well, but it's just amazing that World War II happened in the lifetimes of, our parents or grandparents, and just how bad it was. And it makes any other war I studied in this book look gentlemanly by comparison. In World War II, 3/4 of the victims were civilians, most of them deliberately targeted. It's just stunning. At least in World War I, for all the stupidity and all the carnage, there was a little bit of a code of conduct. And it doesn't mean that it's ever okay to kill 18-year-old boys just because they're in uniform. But, World War II was stunning, and it makes me a little afraid of the human race and a little skeptical of Steven Pinker's hypothesis that the better angels of our nature are really coming out as time moves on and as civilization advances. I hope he's right, but I'm not so sure.
And the last factor is alliances, and I guess World War I is a good example of where alliances could have, had they been structured differently, maybe avoided war.
Yeah, I think the key to our success since 1945 is our alliances, for the most part, have been unambiguous and have been backed up by forward-stationed U.S. military forces abroad. So that if you attack the ally, you're also on day one attacking the Americans. And it's pretty hard to think we'll sit it out once that happens. So the World War I alliances were not like that at all. They were conditional. They did not involve regular military cooperation or exercises. They did not involve stationing of forces on each other's territories. And ultimately, they were more vehicles for facilitating imperialism than they really were for enhancing defense. So yeah, World War I, to me, goes down as notorious for just sort of the hyper-nationalism and imperialism of the time, and how that really helped lay the groundwork for the war itself.
I have one more question for you, Mike, and while I ask it, maybe I'll say to the audience, if any of you have questions, you can start lining up at the microphone right here. My last question is about Afghanistan, because the bungled withdrawal there, I'm sure, is still fresh in the minds of many of us, and you note in the book the testimony before Congress about a year and a half ago by General Milley, the Joint Chiefs Chairman, who said that the U.S. and NATO missions in Afghanistan ended as a strategic defeat for the United States. But you go on to assert that it's possible, given time, that history's balance sheet may actually be more forgiving of that. Why do you think that?
Yeah, and I say that having disagreed with President Biden, because I don't think we had to pull out when we did. We were down to only 5% the number of troops we had before, and I wanted to give the peace talks a real chance because it was clear the Taliban were not sincere in trying to reach power sharing, and the humanitarian debacle of what's become of Afghanistan breaks my heart. I mean, at least there's not a lot of fighting, but there's 20 million out of 40 million people in extreme peril from lack of food and medicine. So I'm very sad about Afghanistan at that level. However, at a U.S. national strategy level, we, first of all, spent 20 years fighting, which meant we showed a lot of people we are prepared to fight hard when you attack our homeland and use a country X and its territory, so to prepare that attack. So I think for future deterrence, we probably achieved more than we sometimes acknowledge, because we showed we're prepared to fight pretty hard once we're attacked. Second, I think that we do have a lot of intelligence assets that we've developed over the years that allow us to do better from a distance than we ever could have before to try to listen in on terrorist communications. It's much better to do counterterrorism on the ground with an indigenous partner that knows the human terrain. So I think we gave up a lot by pulling out, but so far we haven't seen a big sanctuary develop for Al-Qaeda or ISIS. And then, third, as with Vietnam, maybe 20 or 30 years later, it turns out that we work back to a modus vivendi with the former enemy. And it's a relatively less important part of the world anyway, unless you're getting attacked out of there, in which case it becomes important. But, suffering a defeat in Afghanistan in the middle of the Hindu Kush, as much as I love that country and its people, it's not really a top tier national security priority for the United States compared to some others.
Okay, questions?
Does Putin remind you of Hitler with the resentment and the grievance and the grandiose ideas about restoring the Russian Empire?
It's a great question. I would say, thankfully, no, in the sense that he reminds me much more of the World War I leaders who wanted to build up empire, who felt slighted that their country didn't have enough territory, let's say from the Balkans wars of 1912 and 13 and how those had worked out. So the Russian Tsar wasn't very happy that Serbia didn't get more land, and they were all watching the Ottoman Empire fall apart, and they all wanted a piece of that. And they really hated the idea of somebody else, some other country, getting more of it than they. So Putin strikes me as more that kind of leader, which I suppose, compared to your alternative, is the less bad of the two choices, but it's still pretty scary because I think it means he doesn't have much concern about human life, even of his own soldiers. And he does have these grandiose, historical ambitions and grievances that could lead him to keep going.
Fixated on the West.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I've been glancing through your book since I sat down, and at the beginning of your talk, you said that you thought that America had made the wrong choices in the wars that it's chosen. And I'm curious to know, and I also want to say that I think that the modern strategist's primary goal should be to avoid war at all costs. So I'm curious to know how you believe the United States could improve its coercive diplomacy to ensure that war does not happen. In other words, a lot of these wars that are essentially the wrong choice, we went into them, I would imagine, especially since World War II, because of a failure of coercive diplomacy. So how do we ensure that our deterrence and our coercion works effectively?
Yeah, well, first, thank you. First, to be a little more upfront about my own views, when I look back on these wars, I think I can say more easily that they turned out not to have been as important as we thought at the time.
Oh, sure.
I'm not really trying to Monday morning quarterback because, of course, I was part of the Iraq and Afghanistan debates,
Sure.
and I supported going into Afghanistan.
Right.
And I was ambivalent about going into Iraq, but not outright opposed. And I later did support the surge.
Right.
So I don't want to sound too like clairvoyant here about my own abilities, but I think it's just fascinating that these wars that most of the country supported when we began them, all four of the big ones since 1945,
Right.
in retrospect look less important now.
Right.
And I just think but to your question, the single most, I think, successful thing we've learned how to do is to have formal treaties with certain countries where it's unambiguous we would fight to help defend them as if it were American territory, and then have American standing military forces forward deployed or stationed in the key places that are most acutely at threat. Unfortunately, of course, or fortunately, we had decided not to extend that kind of a guarantee to Ukraine, but we said we might someday, which I thought was sort of exactly the wrong place to wind up, because it was like painting a bullseye on Ukraine's back. I'm not blaming us for the war at any moral level. Putin owns the sin. But I think our strategic judgment wasn't very good there. And of course, the Taiwan case is very challenging here as well, because we deliberately broke off our relations and our alliance with them 40 years ago. And we've tried to have it both ways, of being committed enough to their well-being that China thinks we would fight to help defend them, even as we don't have that kind of a formal arrangement. I'm not suggesting we go back to a treaty with Taiwan or a formal recognition of Taiwan as an independent country, but I would say that that's therefore the most dangerous place on earth, given how much China cares about it and how we have this somewhat ambivalent or ambiguous stance ourselves.
Well, let me follow up on that. How would you improve upon that?
I'd ask Nick Lardy. He's the best China scholar in this room and one of the best in the world. But although he's primarily an economist. But Nick, great to see you here. And
are you writing a book?
but I think that what I'm most interested in doing now on the Taiwan question, and that's worthy, of course, of a whole afternoon of discussion. But I do think that the China, I don't really think is going to be as reckless as Russia was. And as long as we make it clear that we will find ways to punish China if they attack Taiwan, maybe economically in the first instance, maybe a fundamental decoupling of the two economies. But if they try to do something blatant and outright, like an all-out invasion, I would like to give Taiwan the tools to be able to resist that. And Taiwan hasn't done a very good job of acquiring those tools. Don't really want it to be just a US-China fight, you know, or for us to be drawn in on day 3 and have to start sinking dozens of Chinese ships when they still are claiming they're just on a maneuver. So I think at a defense planning level, the most important thing to do is to give Taiwan better self-defense capability against the invasion scenario. And then against the blockade scenario, which is what I'm really worried about, we need more economic resilience throughout the Western world so that we can actually engage in that scenario partly with economic warfare and not feel like we have to go sink the entire Chinese Navy the day the blockade begins.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for coming out. Just a couple of questions. One is, how do you view demilitarization, demobilization, reintegration as potentially an alternative to a peace plan in Ukraine? You do not have to have a peace plan in place to have DDR, but where do you see that, like 1, 3, 5 years out? Because you can plan for post-conflict while you have a conflict ongoing. And then secondly, on the question of alliances and technology, using, let's say, like the Joint Strike Fighter program as an example, where you've had the Germans commit to buy planes, the Finns, the Swiss, which is quite a story. Is that the future of alliance, of buying U.S. equipment and developing it, and potentially co-developing programs like that?
Well, I certainly think helping Ukraine have a strong defense is going to continue to be crucial at all phases, right now and then after any kind of a ceasefire and any kind of a apparently durable but always fragile actual peace, especially with Putin still around. We're never going to be able to trust him. But rather than DDR, you use that phrase, and we probably have some similar background on the subject, and we've try to figure out how to take insurgents and convince them to lay down their arms. But Ukraine actually has the other problem. They're trying to turn some of their regular citizens into soldiers, and they need to. So we don't necessarily need DDR for Ukraine. But I do agree with a couple of the other ideas that you put on the table. And to me, the most interesting question is to figure out, how do we create a new security structure or organization that we can bring Ukraine into in the short term as part of a peace, but offer Russia eventual membership once Putin's gone and they've given up their aggressive ways. I think we need that, as opposed to just trying to bring Ukraine into NATO, which to me is going to exacerbate the problem. And I also don't think it's enough just to sell them weapons. I think we need to have a training mission that is essentially a tripwire, where this new organization would supervise the training mission, and therefore Putin and Russian leaders would know that if they attack Ukraine again, they're going to be killing Western soldiers on day one, and therefore we would likely respond. If you don't have that kind of clear commitment, I don't know how you deter Putin. And I would worry that he would just go back to the drawing board after whatever peace deal he claimed to have signed, build up his army, and try again in 5 years. So I think a new security organization and then some kind of a modest scale training presence that involves American troops, but without being under formal NATO auspices. Those are two of the pieces I'm trying to think through with our good buddy Lise Howard, as well as some other scholars. I don't think Lise is here, but I'm referring to my Edgemore group. And Lise Howard's a professor at Georgetown, and we're trying to do some more writing on this question of an alternative security organization that is not NATO, but that has more teeth than, for example, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe does today.
Thanks.
Yeah, during your talk, you didn't mention the Vietnam War at all. I'm wondering, as you did your historical deep dive into that war, as you reviewed the history, was there anything that popped out to you or surprised you that came out of that that might have maybe gone against a lot of the conventional wisdom or lessons learned from that particular conflict, either in a negative or positive sense?
Yeah, you're right. I don't have any big, powerful takeaways that I usually offer up about Vietnam, but just a couple of thoughts. One, I still am struck by the tragedy of it all, and we all, I think a lot of people are, but having spent several months on it for this book, after having thought about it at various stages of my career, I thought it was our worst performance as a national security decision-making process, as Washington writ large, our worst performance as a military. And we had a book event at Brookings for my book a month ago, and General McChrystal was nice enough to be part of that. And I said to him, I didn't blame the U.S. military for this bad track record that we've had since 1945, except in regard to Vietnam, where I did think the military did a poor job. And not, I'm not talking about most of the people who served. I'm talking obviously about leadership and strategy, the belief that you could essentially kill your way to depopulating the ranks of the Viet Cong to where they couldn't maintain a force. It was, I don't want to make a moral equivalency, but I don't like those kinds of tactics as a rule. And we see some of them today in the world, and I don't like them today either. So the tragedy of Vietnam is at multiple levels just overwhelming to me. And I do think, it was one thing to see North Korea invade South Korea in 1950 and change our minds that we had to respond there, right next to Japan. And Vietnam was so far away from anything really crucial to us. And I know it's unfair at this stage in history to go back and be overly critical of the decision makers of that day. And I'm old enough and have been in this field long enough to have been lucky to meet people like McGeorge Bundy before they died, and even Robert McNamara was a Brookings trustee. And so, again, I can only imagine what it was like to try to deal with the world they were living in. And I didn't spend a lot of time on the book trashing them. But I do think if we were going to try to hold off the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong in Vietnam, and I would have hoped that we really wouldn't have, and maybe Kennedy would have decided not to if he had lived. But I think we should have tried the combined action platoon concept of the Marine Corps, which is really a population protection concept, and not the firepower intensive approach of General Westmoreland. It might still have failed, but I think it would have failed with only half the same number of U.S. troops and probably 1/10 the casualties on all sides.
Thank you.
Okay, we have time for two more questions.
One of the most interesting characters to me of all this time period is Zhou Enlai, the foreign minister and prime minister of China, who was present for all the events from the 30s to the 70s. And now the Chinese leadership seems to be completely different. They they're more annoying in their presentations of foreign policy than he ever would have tried to provoke or anything like that. What's your take on that? What's happening there?
Yeah, well, I'm tempted to give Nick the microphone, but I'll do my best because Henry Kissinger has talked about this in public, so I can also quote him in private. But as some of you know, I've had the privilege of being on the Defense Policy Board with him, and he's 99 and a half, and he's unbelievable. And whether you're a Kissinger fan or not, his longevity and his thoughtfulness are pretty noteworthy. And so every so often in the Defense Policy Board discussions, he'll have been quiet for an hour and a half, and you wonder if he's falling asleep, which he has a right to do at 99 and a half, but he never is. And at some point, he'll clear his throat and he'll speak. And when some of the folks on the policy board were asking about the likelihood or debating the likelihood of whether China would just attack Taiwan, Kissinger then told us stories about his conversations with Mao and with Deng Xiaoping about when China went to war with India in 1962 and with Vietnam in 1979. And from Kissinger's perspective, the Chinese, in his opinion, still tend to be cautious and not so much interested in outright conquest as in changing psychology and creating a kind of climate of coercion that the earlier questioner was trying to get at. And so Kissinger, he wasn't dismissing the possibility of war against Taiwan that the Chinese would attack, but he thought it would be more likely they would use force incrementally and sort of psychologically as much as for outright win. And so maybe, if Kissinger's right, maybe some of the legacy of Chou Enlai and some other patient Chinese thinkers, not to mention Sun Tzu and some others, maybe that legacy is still there. And I tend to be hopeful that the Chinese are not going to make the kind of reckless mistake that Putin has made. We have to do more things to reduce the odds further, but I'm hopeful that we can actually avoid that war.
Thanks. When you say that in some cases we've chosen the wars poorly in terms of our strategic interest and so forth, how much of the blame would you assign to the domestic politics of the situation? And you mentioned Lincoln, of course, before the Civil War, and I think of Roosevelt finding it difficult to prepare the U.S. for war in Europe. Truman later got tagged with losing China. How much might that have played a role in the decision to go into Korea? And then I also recall reading that Johnson lived in fear of Goldwater for the 1964 elections, outflanking him on the right. So when the Gulf of Tonkin occurred, he felt the need to make it a bigger deal, perhaps even a fabricated affair, just to avoid the domestic political repercussions in 1964. So when you look at all of that, it seems like very frequently there's been this domestic political motivation between some of the wars we've chosen to fight and perhaps fight wrongly.
Yeah, thank you for the question, and thanks everybody for the opportunity to be here and for the conversation. So what I would say is that domestic politics always play a role, but I only think they led to one of the four, Vietnam. In Korea, like I said, the invasion was on June 25th, 1950. The day before, basically nobody was thinking of South Korea as a crucial U.S. friend or asset. The day after, Congress didn't even want to have a vote on authorizing war. They were content just to let Truman, use the UN Security Council vote. Remember, neither the Soviets nor China were there. They were sort of boycotting. We hadn't let communist China have the seat yet, so the Soviets boycotted. So therefore, we could push through the Security Council resolution authorizing a multinational response. And Congress didn't even want to vote. And Truman didn't even ask them. That was the original mistake, by the way. It was the first time we did a big thing without declaring war or bringing Congress into the debate. I think that was regrettable. There should have been more politics in that one. Vietnam, I think, definitely was a lot about the politics of the day and the fear of communism and the legacy of Korea and the fall of China and the Cuban Missile Crisis and everything else. Afghanistan, President Bush, I think, did what 90% of Americans wanted him to do, even if we weren't really sure what we were doing on October 7th, 2001, when we began that conflict, and didn't really have a strategy for how to win it. But I don't think too many people were in favor of leaving the Taliban alone. So a lot of the details may have been affected by politics, but not so much the core decision. And then we come to Iraq. And we could debate the Iraq War forever in this kind of a forum. But there were certainly a lot of politics in how the Bush administration tried to sell the war and bring along a lot of Democrats, which they did successfully. If you go back to the vote, it was 77-23 in the Senate, for example. But I don't think the Bush administration invaded Iraq for reasons of domestic politics. I think it was conviction. It may have been the wrong conviction. It may have been, a wrong weighting of priorities, and it certainly was poor preparation. But I don't really think it was fundamentally about sort of getting one up on the Democrats. So I would say of the four, only Vietnam really happened because of domestic politics to a large extent.
Thanks. Thanks for a great presentation.
Kind of you. Thank you.
So military history for the modern strategist, whether you consider yourself a modern strategist or not,
You all
should
are.
get it or gift it. It's really a very useful contribution to the literature about war. Mike, thanks so much for coming here and for your discussion.
Thanks, everybody.